Part 5, Case Study Recruitment. In this section, we're going to just do a deep dive, which is the use of AI systems in the recruitment industry and human resources more generally. We're going to talk about the ethics of this, or generally of recruitment. We're going to talk about how these systems are being used and what's being assessed, and how we can use an audit method to be able to assess the fairness of these systems and how ethical these systems are. So let me start off by talking a little bit about the HR recruitment industry and the use of AI in this space. So you've got lots and lots of candidates for particular jobs. So let's say you're going into civil service, or you're applying for a kind of graduate program in a bank or a major company. These companies have got to find a way of processing these hundreds and often thousands of applicants. So what they do is they usually employ some kind of AI-driven recruitment or kind of automated recruitment service. And these services, they can sit at different parts of the recruitment process. They can sit at the start, and they can sit right at the end. And there's just lots and lots of different ways in which you can use an AI system or a machine learning system to assess candidates. So first, you can kind of use it to aggregate appropriate candidates. So you can just collect, or you can group. You can interview candidates through a chatbot. You can imagine that replaces the need for a human interviewer. You can do video assessment. Here you get recorded speaking and answering questions, and they can do lots of analysis on your face and your sentiment and things like that. You can use these systems to sieve CVs, to look at appropriate CVs, and to kind of pass CVs, which is appropriate and which isn't, and so on and so forth. So there's lots and lots of ways in which you can use these AI systems more generally in human resources, like matching jobs to roles for maybe people internal to a company, to do performance measurements, to list jobs, to calculate salaries and bonuses and things like that. So it's a huge, huge application of AI systems. Wow, this is a real ethical minefield. So first and foremost, recruitment is highly sensitive. So it's an area which has a huge impact on people's life prospects. So that's something very important to think about. You know, wages, opportunities, the kind of consequences of working in a particular place, the experiences that you get, the networking opportunities, and so on and so forth. So where you work or your ability to find work has significant impact on your life prospects. Now, the ethics of recruitment really, it reflects social bias. So we note here this kind of mirroring effect, or hiring oneself. So most of the time, people in work situations, they look for people that they think they would probably get along with, people that probably socialize the way that they socialize, and maybe come from a similar background to the one that they come from, etc. Although everyone will say when they're recruiting, they're looking for, in quotes, the best candidate. In effect, sometimes you see a lot of mirroring effect. Groups of people, teams, they often look very much similar to each other. You even see this in the research space. And how do you know if someone's the same? Well, they probably look the same. Maybe they signal through the way that they speak, their accents, the way that they dress, and the way they conduct themselves, etc., etc. So there's lots and lots of ways to signal that someone is part of an in-group or will fit in quotes, to what other people are like. So this causes a kind of exclusion of people who fall out of that normativity, purportedly normative state. So it reflects this kind of social bias of these kind of clusters. The assessment biases, things like IQ, psychometrics, etc., etc. I'll bring this up because, you know, one of the kind of paradoxes about an IQ test is that it's supposed to be kind of, well, some people think that it's testing raw capacity or ability, but you can train to improve your IQ results from an IQ test. So if that's the case, if you can train to do that, then how does that reflect kind of raw ability? And if that training is effectively being given by particular types of schooling or social conditioning, then what are you actually testing when you do these kind of assessments. So the assessments are very biased towards the kind of social worlds that people come from, or backgrounds they come from. It might not be assessing the actual abilities of people. A really good example of that is the kind of Oxbridge interview. There's a kind of anecdotally, a student was telling me that when he went for his interview, it sounded like the person was shouting at him. And then when I explained that, no, they were just being that's just the way that they speak. It was very interesting for me to hear that. It was just so alien to him. He was from a particular working class background. That the kind of customization people were getting from their other kinds of schools that people were going for their Oxford interview, that was very normal. So you can see that the kind of assessment can significantly bias the kind of results or the assessments that are taking place. And finally, we need to think about human oversight in these contexts. So sometimes companies use these systems to just provide recommendations. So they'll say, okay, rank these candidates, and then send me the top 20 candidates, for example. But then they just say, okay, I'll just take the top 20 candidates then, or I'll just start from candidate 1 to candidate 2, and so on and so forth. So we need to meaningfully assess recommendations. And that's a bigger point about human oversight. And I came up in earlier part of the course where we're saying, when someone does do human oversight, they need to be sufficiently qualified. The human oversight needs to be meaningful. And finally, it's an imperative that we provide explanations for when people don't get a job, or when things don't go right, or why a system made particular kinds of recommendations. This is crucial so that we can assess whether or not the system was made in a fair way, the decision was made in a fair way. And it's a very important part of the process. So that's the kind of ethics of the use of these systems in these contexts. So the first question is, how is the system being used? I talked about it a little bit in the previous slide. So let's say you've got a graduate program, you've got 2,000, 3,000 people applying. You need to do some filtering. That's what we can call a kind of mass screening. There's lots and lots of bias there. You could just be weeding out whole groups of people who are just, when you're doing it at scale, are starting to really kind of reflect systematic biases. So you might be biased in that context towards gender, towards someone's racial group, and so on and so forth. So the mass screening has real kind of, let's call it systemic or large scale opportunities to weed out large groups of people in a way that is biased. So that's a real concern. Then let's say at a later stage where we really get into the point where we're doing interviews with people, where there's a small group of people that maybe being recorded and so on. Now we've got a whole nother host of ethical problems that this presents. So first and foremost, what is the ethical status? How fair is it to assess someone's facial expressions? Now this is a very contentious debate within the literature. It's about, are there, let's say, biological or evolutionary or some kind of hard-baked expressions? And if there are, then you can kind of objectively identify them. The way somebody blushes, or somebody smiles, or somebody sweats, and so on and so forth. Or are even the way in which we express ourselves physically, in our facial expressions, are they actually socially constructed? Are they results of the kind of cultures that we get from? The reason why that's important is that if you're doing a kind of interview and you're assessing someone's face or facial expressions and so on, or their words that they're using, we need to think about what are our categories of successful and unsuccessful, or a good answer or a bad answer. Are they tracking things which people will consider to be reasonably true, or are they tracking things which are just reflection of particular kinds of social constructs? So here you can imagine just how ethically contentious and issues of fairness can arise in that context. So again, this can kind of just reflect social bias. So there's different problems of fairness at different points in which the recruitment system can be used, and those different points of contention are things which you'd have to evaluate ethically in terms of the fairness at different stages in different ways. Now this, I kind of touched on it on the previous one. We need to talk about what's being assessed. I said maybe in the large scale, in the early point, maybe it's just a CV. and maybe very much later on, it could be the facial recognition. So that stuff about the facial recognition is sentiment analysis, and sentiment analysis is very, very contentious. So you can imagine a situation where someone's expressions are being interpreted as nervous, and maybe the same kind of thing can be interpreted as enthusiastic. When we're trying to judge someone's face, when we're making these kind of inferences off the back of it, we're in a real kind of quagmire of trying to justify or affirm what is a correct form of categorizing particular kinds of ways of expression or reacting. And you can do this not just from your kind of facial expressions, but you can talk about the way someone speaks. Let's say someone speaks with a particular accent, or somebody uses particular kinds of words. I mean, what can we really fairly infer from that kind of stuff? Same with the text, same with written answers, and so on and so forth. Now, I bring up, a lot of people have been talking about it in terms of phrenology, and that's why I bring it up here. So phrenology was a kind of, was an approach that is no longer used, of course, from the 19th century, maybe even before then, where you would assess the shape of somebody's head, and then make certain judgments about the person's character or state from the physical shape or bumps and curves on the head of someone. So that's widely disabused. There's no relationship between, I don't know, a bump on someone's head and whether or not they're trustworthy or kind or like honest or conscientious and so on and so forth. So a lot of people are now saying it's so contentious that is this the modern form of phrenology? So I just want to raise that in terms of the level of kind of critique in this space with respect to the fairness of using these kinds of systems. So finally, okay, let's say we have this system, we've done a system, and we want to we use the system and we're going to use it, or we're going to justify using it. What should we do? So New York City in America has the regulator has called for mandatory bias audits. Here you'd have to actually prove, or you'd have to test, and we spoke about this in the previous part of the course, where you actually have fairness metrics that you can assess and that you can actually report. So that's what people are talking about. The system has to be ready for third-party inspection, or maybe even a third party actually has to do this and should be able to report the fairness metrics. And then we move into the space of assurance and certification. So these recruitment systems need to be assured, and then some kind of certification or report or some way in which to communicate that, yes, these systems have been assessed, these systems are fair, these systems are assured. So this is when we get into the conversation about certification. So that is the case study of recruitment. You can see it's a very ethically contentious space. We need to talk about the ethics generally of recruitment, the ethics more specifically about recruitment in the use of AI, machine learning, and we need to talk about where the system's being used, at what point in the pipeline, in the recruitment pipeline. We need to talk about what's being assessed, and then we need to talk about, and we spoke about rather, that now these systems are being audited and there's calls for mandatory audits of these systems, so they should be able to be justified and transparent. Thank you.